Good morning, Honors Algebra 1. It is Monday, May 2nd, and today we're kind of doing a review lesson. We're summarizing all the ways that we can solve a quadratic equation. So this is 12.5. It's called Methods of Solutions. So we're going to review the 4 ways this year that we have learned how to solve a quadratic equation. Remember, a quadratic equation has to have a squared term, and the squared term is the highest exponential term there is. You can't have a cubic or a fourth degree or fifth degree. X squared term has to be there, and it is the highest level of exponent. Okay, so the one of the first ways, well, this is actually the most recent thing that we learned, was the quadratic formula. X equals negative b plus minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac over 2a. Now, when do we use the quadratic formula? Well, we can use it any time that we have our equation, our quadratic equation, in standard form. That means it's in descending order of exponents and it's set equal to 0. And then we just define what a, b, and c are, and we can use the formula anytime. Now, factoring. We've done that in previous chapters, and there's some trinomials that are easy to factor, and we can factor those, set equal to 0, and then find out what our two solutions are. There's another way that we can factor, and that is when you're missing the c term or the constant term, you will always be able to factor easily. This is a binomial, and you'll be able to factor out the greatest common factor. Well, look right here. X is definitely going to be a common factor that we can factor out. And then if A and B share a common factor, we can factor that out. We're going to see an example with that in just a minute. Okay, so factoring if you don't have a c term, or if it's just a trinomial that's easy to factor. Now, how about taking the square root of both sides? Well, that's easy to do when you have your squared term, and then you're missing your bx term, and you just have a constant. You can set your ax squared equal to your, in this case, negative c, and then take and divide both sides by a, and take the square root of x. So taking the square roots of both sides is a great method when you don't have the bx term. You just have the square term and the constant. And finally, completing the square. Well, the completing the square is a good method to use when your leading coefficient, that means your coefficient of your x squared term is 1, and when your b value is even. You know, when it's odd, like a 7, you'd have to take 7 halves and square that. That's a little bit of a hassle. So I definitely recommend using the quadratic formula if your b value is odd and if your a value is anything other than 1 or negative 1. Okay, so let's take 4 examples here, and we're going to try using the 4 different methods. Let me turn this light out so we can not have that glare. Okay, let's start with the first one. 12x squared minus 108 equals 0. Well, that really falls into our number 3 example here, and that is we have a squared term and a constant, so we can take the square root of both sides very easily. So let's go ahead and isolate our squared term. I've got 12x squared is equal to a positive 108. Let's divide both sides by 12, and I get x squared is equal to 9. Well, how many solutions am I going to have? 2 solutions. X can be both positive and negative 3. And look how easy that was. Okay, that is taking the square roots of both sides when I only have a squared term and a constant. So keep that in mind when you're doing the homework. Now, look at this. This is a binomial where, as this was a binomial, but this time we're missing the constant. So let's look over here. Number 2. We're going to use factoring because we're missing the constant. Now, when you're missing the constant, what I'm going to do here is look for the greatest common factor. Well, 4 is a factor of 4 and 56. I'm going to take out a 4. Both terms have a t. I'm going to take a t out, leaving me with t minus, let's see, 4 goes into 5 1 time, 4 goes into 16 4 times, and there I have easily factored that binomial. Now that I've factored the binomial, what I can do is I can say, okay, 4t has to equal 0, or t minus 14 is a factor has to equal 0, because this times this has a product of 0. So what are my options? What would make 4t equal to 0? 0. What would make t minus 14 equal to 0? 14. And there you have it. T equals 0 and 14 are my two solutions to this quadratic equation. You can always plug them back in to check. Okay, let's move on to letter C here. Now what's happening in C, let me move out of the way, is we have an n squared plus 8n minus 2 equals 0. Now, quadratic formula is fine for this. You can go ahead and do that. You can actually use the quadratic formula on any of these. But in these two examples here, I definitely wouldn't bother because it's so much more involved. And here, this is so easy to factor. And this, this is so easy to take the square roots of both sides. And this is so easy to factor. So over here, you could use the quadratic formula. But since my leading coefficient is 1, since my coefficient of the first degree term n is even, I'm going to go ahead and complete the square. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's recall that I have n squared plus 8n. I'm going to bring the negative 2 to the other side. I'm going to divide 8 by 2 and square it, which would give me 4 squared is 16. Don't forget, you have to add 16 to both sides of the equation or you're not going to get the right answer. Okay, now this side now is a perfect square trinomial, and so I'm going to write it in factored form, and over here I get an 18. Now, here I'm going to take the square root of the left side. On the right side, I'm going to take the positive and negative square root of 18. Let's go ahead and solve for n. N is going to equal, bring the 4 over, make it negative, plus minus. Now, what is 18? 18 is 9 times 2, and the square root of 9 is 3. So I'm going to bring the root of 9 out and make it a 3, and I'm left with a 2. And there is my answer to this quadratic equation using completing the square. Okay, so that was easy to do with completing the square because I had a leading coefficient of 1 and I had an even coefficient of my first degree term. Alrighty, now I think you can guess what's going to happen on the last side, but let's go ahead and do it just so we can have a good review of that and make sure you're feeling good about it. This is 4x squared minus 12x plus 7 equals 0. Okay, well this is even, so completing the square would be great, but this is not a 1. So completing the square would be a real pain. So, I can tell you this is not going to factor, and we can't get the square root of both sides because we have this x term here. All right, now, so we're going to use our friend, the quadratic formula. So let's go ahead and define our values. A is 4, B is, careful, negative 12, and C is 7. So my coefficient, my variable is x. So x equals negative b, which is 12, plus minus the square root of b squared, which is 144, minus 4 times a is 4, and c is 7, over 2 times 4. Okay, so I'm going to get 12 plus minus the square root. Now, I'm going to go ahead and use my calculator here. I'm just going to enter in 144 minus 4 times 7. Is that right? No, I didn't do that right. I'm sorry. 144 minus 4 times 7. What did I just do? Okay. All right. So I get 32. 32 over 8. Now let's go ahead and simplify the root of 32. Well, what is 32? 32 is 16 times 2. And what's the square root of 16? 4. And so I'm going to take the root of 16 out and put a 4, root 2 here over 8. Now I am almost done. So final answer is x equals. Now, what can I factor out of 12 and 4 and 8? What factor do they all have in common? They all have a 4 in common. So let's factor out a 4 out of the numerator and factor out a 4 out of the denominator. And those 4s would cancel out. So what basically I'm going to do to reduce this, I'm going to divide every coefficient here, or every constant, by 4, and I'll have my answer. Okay, 12 divided by 4 is 3. I'm going to divide this by 4, and I get a root 2. What's inside the root is never affected, okay, by this canceling. You're only going to be factoring out a 4 from the coefficient of the root. Okay, now take out a 4 from the 8, and I have a 2, and there's my answer. in reduced form. X equals 3 plus minus root 2 over 2. And there's our review. Quadratic formula, completing the square, factoring, and taking the square roots of both sides. So you have a quiz today, and then you have some review problems and some mixed review. So I'll see you at Zoom today if you need any help, or I will be talking to you again on Tuesday morning. Bye-bye.